Hi, my name is Adrienne Ritchie, and I'm so grateful to be a part of the student colloquium at the University of Southern Indiana. I think the topic of the impact of engagement is a terrific topic, and my presentation goes along nicely with this topic. I'm focusing on the lessons learned from the Irish language revival, and this covers the impact of engagement of political leaders, society members, school members, and individuals as a whole. So the purpose of my presentation is to focus on the last 100 years of education policy regarding the Irish language in the Republic of Ireland and how it has influenced the percentage of the population that speak the Irish language. My presentation will go as follows. There will be an introduction to Ireland and the Irish language. We will focus on the Irish language decline and revival in Ireland. Then we will focus on the education policy that has been most effective in the Irish language revival. After that, we will focus on the insights that we can glean from that particular education policy that is covered. And then for conclusion, I will give recommendations about further research that can be done regarding this topic. Okay, so Ireland, as most of you know, is an island off the coast of Great Britain. And the Gaelic people date back, or the Gaels date back to 500 AD. During this time period, all throughout their history from the 12th century, there has been conflict with England, beginning with the Anglo-Norman invasion. The Irish language is from the Gaelic Celtic Indo-European branch. We will specifically look at the history, especially beginning in the 1800s, but the late 1700s and all throughout the 1800s, the Irish language and the other Gaelic languages, which are Manx Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and then the third is Irish Gaelic, all the Gaelic languages began to experience a sharp decline in the number of speakers. This was mostly due to imperialism from England and Great Britain, the Great Famine, which affected specifically farmers in Ireland, and immigration, which was a result of the Great Famine and also the economic situation at the time in the 1800s in Ireland. So the difference between the Irish Gaelic language versus Manx Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic, which now Manx Gaelic actually died in 1974. It had its last native speaker die. And Scottish Gaelic is only spoken by less than 2% of the Scottish population. The difference between these two is that in 1922, Ireland succeeded in establishing a free independent government. This was a long fought achievement. And so the Conrada na Gaelic or Gaelic League was a big part of this, at least in a cultural sense. They were a league that pushed for the education of the Irish language and also Irish sports and Irish culture. And so this is something that really helped the fight for independence because it was something for people to gather around and fight for that Irish Republic independence. Just to know, as you can see in this map, the northern part of Ireland is actually still part of Great Britain, and it's an independent country called Northern Ireland. And then the green part, or the majority of the island, is the Republic of Ireland. And this doesn't pertain to my topic a lot, but if you're interested, you can look up the conflict. It's called the Troubles, and it goes from about 1970s even till the early 2000s, and that can cover the conflict between Protestants and Catholics and people who politically were aligned with Great Britain versus people who wanted to join the Northern Ireland with the Republic of Ireland. But that is an interesting topic, which we will not cover today. So what I will focus on today is the Irish language revival. So in 1926, this was the first census done after the independence of Ireland. There were only 18.2% of the Irish population that could speak Irish Gaelic. Yet, almost 100 years later, in 2022, 40.4% of the population now speaks Irish Gaelic. The impact of this cannot be overstated. This is a very, very significant, well done Irish language revival. This often does not happen with languages that do not have a significant political or monetary value in culture as Irish does. It's much more monetarily valuable to study English instead of Irish. But the fact that they rose their percentage of the population that speaks Irish this much in just less than 100 years is really remarkable. And that's why I chose this topic. So one thing that they did several things. They used policy to shape this shift in the language revival. They decided to make Irish the official language of Ireland. They also, for a time, required police men and women to speak Irish. That was later changed because it was too hard to employ people that could speak Irish. Also, they did put in all city and road signs have to have Irish on them. But the most significant policies that were made regarding the language revival by far were the education policies. And that's what we will focus on. So the Irish language education policy, it was very impactful. So when the Irish state was founded in 1922, almost at the exact same time, there came out what is termed by researchers as a mega policy. And I don't have a lot of time to go into in as much detail as I would like, but in short, this was them making the Irish language a core subject in every primary school and the medium of instruction for at least 1 hour a day in all schools. It also became a core subject for an intermediate certificate, and also it was a required subject, and you would have to pass a test for it in order to receive the leaving certificate, which was equivalent to our high school diploma. So they really pushed the Irish language very hard in education. No one in the public school system could go through that system without at least being semi-fluent or being able to pass entry-level exams in Irish. They were learning Irish every single day. But by the 1970s, so about 45 years later, there started to be a movement called the Language Freedom Movement. And this was a big coalition, actually, of policymakers, teachers, parents, students alike that were not satisfied with the current education policy. And the reason was they were finding that many students were falling by the wayside, that this mega policy was too strict, that there were already students that were not very academically focused in general, and school was already hard for them. And then you throw in the aspect of learning for them a foreign language, and it was a required foreign language, an hour a day, the medium of instruction would be in that language. And so kids started dropping out of school, especially because the Irish language requirement to pass the leaving certificate was so strict, and they had to take these core classes in order to graduate. They had to be able to get a certificate in some level of fluency. It was quite strict, and many students were not able to, or were too disillusioned to continue working towards that, and they were seeing many students drop out of school. So as you can see, many people were concerned about this, and this campaign for the language freedom movement gained a lot of traction. And in 1973, they did succeed in changing the education policy. So because of this, the last 100 years have been broken up into kind of two eras. So the first era is the mega policy era, where there's more strict requirements regarding the Irish language in all public schools. The second era I will talk about right now, but it begins with this Language Freedom Movement Act, where they changed the education policy, and they essentially removed the Irish language requirement to pass the leaving certificate. And this was very monumental for people who were concerned about those that were falling off the path of education. And But Irish was still going to be a core subject. It was just going to be taught as a foreign language and still a core subject that everyone would need to take. But there was no requirement of the medium of instruction being in Irish. And it still was required that you would take some foreign language to enter universities. And that foreign language would need to be Irish to enter Irish university. Pretty similar to how usually there's a requirement to take at least 1 or 2 years of foreign language in high school to enter an American university. So, like I said, this second era, it actually was quite interesting because with the change of strict Irish language policies, people were concerned that it would result in a decline of the Irish language revival. But it actually didn't. What ended up happening was still everyone was learning the Irish language because it was a core subject. It was just not as strictly enforced. So maybe they weren't learning it as quickly, or some weren't learning it as well. But what happened was a lot of parents and students started being interested in Irish medium immersion schools during this same time period. So that would be an equivalent if you're familiar with dual immersion programs in the United States, where a lot or most of the instruction in that school would be in the foreign language, in this case, the Irish language. So in 1972, right before this shift in policy, there were only 11 primary schools and 5 post-primary schools that were Irish medium immersion schools in Ireland. Yet in 2022, just 51 years later, there were 255 primary schools and 73 post-primary schools that were offering Irish medium immersion. And this really came from the interest of parents and students. This was not a government mandated immersion school. The growth of those schools came because there was a higher demand of people that wanted to be in them. And there was a survey done, and the parents that chose for Irish medium schools for their kids chose it because of the great benefits of bilingualism, the great academic reputation of the programs, and because they had an interest in the Irish language. This similar study and survey also asked people that if Ireland would lose its identity as an independent, separate culture and nation without the Irish language. And 64% agreed or strongly agreed. So I think that information is just telling that people were still very interested in learning the Irish language, but there needed to be some sort of middle ground where not all students would have to be so intense in the Irish language because students were falling behind and dropping out. So for my research, I looked at these 2 different eras of policy, and then I actually researched every single census that I could find that was done in Ireland from 1926 until 2022. And I found in each census the percentage of Irish speakers recorded in that census and the number of Irish speakers. So I put that information into this graph, as you can see, and I also calculated the rate of growth in each era. So we can look at the first era with the more strict mandatory government policies, and we see that that there was a growth rate of 54.64% over a 45-year span. So that's very significant. And that comes out to about a growth rate of 1.2% per year. So we're talking about a growth rate of the percentage of Irish speakers in Ireland. So the first 45 years with the mega policy that was a little bit stricter, it was very effective in promoting the Irish language and elevating how many people in Ireland spoke that language. The second era, people were very worried that it would be a sharp decline, that the revival would lose traction and it would, be a little bit disastrous for people that have been working so hard to promote this Irish language. But that actually wasn't the case. The rate of growth did decline a little bit, but we can talk about the significance of that in just a second. So the second era, the rate of growth was 42.7 over 51 years. And that comes out to about 0.83% per year. So that's still quite a significant growth rate of the percentage of Irish speakers. even with the less strict policies that were more inclusive of all students. And this difference comes out to just 0.37% per year. So with the more inclusive programs, that really just resulted in a decline of 0.37 per year, which in my opinion, so the insights that I gleaned from this was that yes, mandatory policies and strict government regulation about education in the Irish language, it was effective, but I think the argument can be made that it was at the risk of education as a whole for students that were not as adept in language or interested in that, and that had negative consequences as they dropped out. I think the argument can be made that as we look at language revivals throughout the world, we can learn from the Irish language revival and see that yes, government mandated stricter policies are effective, but it's more inclusive, and maybe you could even say it's more able to last for a longer time with the changes of population immigration in this globalizing world to include some core mandated government courses, but also to offer immersion programs for those that are interested, make it less government mandated and more of a personal interest level of education. So I would recommend for further research that people could study how other areas that have had successful language revivals have implemented education policies. Some places you could study are Israel and the language of Hebrew, or the preservation of the French language in Eastern Canada in the Quebec region. So I think that could provide more insight on this topic. And further, the insights that we can glean from these language revivals that have already occurred could impact other languages that are at risk of language death or decreasing in the amount of people that can speak them. For example, Native American languages in the United States or Aboriginal languages in Australia. So just to conclude, I so appreciate you listening to my presentation today, and I'm so grateful to be a part of this colloquium. I chose this topic because I feel that language is extremely important, and when people are able to speak their native language, I feel that they are the most represented and they are seen as individuals and individual thinkers. And I think anytime a language dies, it is a negative thing for all of society. And so I think that it's important to continue to research language revivals that have succeeded in the past and how we can implement those types of policies in languages that are at risk of language death. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the colloquium.